I didn't know his name that night, only that if I closed the door, he would die on my doorstep. The needle slipped between my fingers for the third time, pricking the side of my thumb, but I barely felt it anymore. After 14 hours bent over a borrowed sewing machine in a room that smelled like fabric, dust, and cheap detergent, pain had become background noise, like the hum of the flickering light above me or the distant traffic crawling past midnight outside my window. I wiped the tiny bead of blood on my apron and kept stitching because stopping meant not making rent, and not making rent meant going back to a place I had sworn I'd never return to. My name is Clara Whitmore. And at that moment, my entire world measured no more than 400 square feet, a rusted radiator, and a calendar where every square was already overdue. The clock on the wall read 1:47 a.m. when the first sound broke through the silence. Not loud, not dramatic, just something wrong. A dull thud, followed by the scrape of something against brick, just beyond the thin wall that separated my workspace from the alley. I froze, needle hovering midair, my breath caught halfway between inhale and doubt. In my neighborhood, you learned quickly which sounds to ignore and which ones could change your life. This one felt like the second kind. I told myself to stay put, to finish the seam, to mind my business like everyone else did, but then came another sound, softer this time, like someone trying and failing to stay on their feet. And something inside me tightened in a way I couldn't explain. I stood before I realized I had decided to move, my chair legs scraping loudly against the floor, the noise echoing in the small room as if warning me to stop. I didn't listen. I crossed to the door, my hand hovering over the handle, my pulse loud enough to fill the silence. Don't, I whispered to myself, but my fingers had already turned the lock. The night air slipped in first, cool and carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. And then I saw him. He was half in shadow, half under the weak glow of a broken street lamp. One hand braced against the wall as if the brick were the only thing keeping him upright. His suit, what I could see of it, was too clean, too sharp for this alley, like it belonged to a different city entirely, one made of glass and money instead of peeling paint and broken sidewalks. For a second, we just looked at each other. His eyes were open, alert in a way that didn't match the rest of him, dark and steady and entirely out of place in someone who looked like he had just lost a battle with gravity. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice low, controlled, like he was stating a fact instead of asking for help. I should have listened. I should have stepped back inside, locked the door, and let the night swallow whatever had followed him into that alley. But I didn't. Instead, I moved toward him, one cautious step at a time, my heart pounding against my ribs as if it already knew the cost of what I was about to do. Neither should you, I replied, my voice quieter than I expected, steadier than I felt. Up close, the details sharpened, the fine stitching on his jacket, the weight of the fabric, the kind of quality I only saw in magazines I couldn't afford, and something else beneath it all, something that didn't belong to my world at all. He watched me like he was memorizing every movement, every breath, calculating something I couldn't see. Go back inside, he said, softer now, but no less certain. I shook my head before I could stop myself. Not tonight, I said, and that was the moment everything changed, though I wouldn't understand that until much later, when I realized that opening that door hadn't just let him in. It had let something else in with him, something that would rewrite every line of my life from that point forward. He swayed once, just enough for me to realize how close he was to collapsing. An instinct moved faster than fear as I reached for him, my hands hesitating for a fraction of a second before making contact with the fabric of his jacket, cool and impossibly smooth beneath my fingers. He was heavier than I expected, not just in weight but in presence, like the air around him carried something dense and unspoken, something that did not belong in a narrow alley behind a failing tailoring shop. Do not, he started, his voice tightening as if even speaking cost him something, but the rest of the sentence never came because his balance gave out and suddenly I was the only thing keeping him upright. Yeah, you are not finishing that sentence, I muttered, more to steady myself than him, shifting my stance and guiding him toward the open door with small, careful steps that felt much longer than the 10 feet they actually were. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured, as if the wrong choice at the wrong second might break something neither of us could afford to lose. inside. The room felt smaller with him in it, like the walls had leaned in to watch. I eased him down onto the old couch I used as both a break space and, on nights I could not afford to go home, a bed, and only then did I realize my hands were trembling. He noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes tracked everything, sharp and unblinking, even now. "You are afraid," he said quietly, not as an accusation, just an observation. I let out a short breath. That almost sounded like a laugh. "Of course I am," I said, stepping back to put a sliver of space between us. "But you still need help." For a moment, neither of us moved. The ticking clock filled the silence, loud and steady, counting something I could not name. Then his gaze dropped, just briefly, to his side, and I followed it. There was something wrong there, something he had been trying not to show, something carefully hidden beneath control. "Sit still," I said before I could second guess myself, already moving toward the small cabinet where I kept the closest thing I had to supplies, a box of thread, a pair of scissors, and a few items meant for small accidents, not whatever this was. I knelt beside him, close enough now to notice the faint scent of something expensive beneath the sharper edge of the night air, and for a second, the contrast made no sense at all. "This is going to be unconventional," I admitted, my voice softer now, more focused, the way it got when my hands knew what to do even if my mind had not caught up yet. He studied me like he was trying to understand a language he had never learned. "You should have walked away," he said, quieter this time. I shook my head, already reaching for the seam of his jacket, fingers steadying as I slipped into habit, into something familiar. "Maybe," I replied, carefully working the fabric aside. But I did not. The room seemed to hold its breath with us. The hum of the light, the ticking clock, the distant city all fading into something softer, something suspended. I focused on the small, precise movements, the kind that had paid my bills and kept me alive, and for the first time since opening that door, my fears shifted into something else, something steadier, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. He did not look away, not once. And in that silence, with his eyes fixed on me and my hands working to keep him here, I had the strange, unsettling feeling that this was not the moment I saved his life, but the moment he decided to remember mine. The thread pulled tight between my fingers, smooth and familiar, the only thing in that room that still made sense, and I focused on it the way I always did when everything else threatened to slip out of control. In and out, steady, precise, each motion measured like a quiet promise that I knew what I was doing even if the rest of my life said otherwise. He did not flinch, not even once. And that unsettled me more than anything else, because most people reacted, most people showed something. But Adrian Moretti just watched, his breathing controlled, his gaze sharp enough to make me feel like I was the one being examined. "You learned that somewhere better than this," he said after a while, his voice low but clearer now, strength returning in layers I could almost see. I did not look up, not yet. "I learned where I could afford to," I answered, guiding the final pass of thread through fabric and skin with careful hands that refused to shake now. The words hung between us, heavier than they should have been. I finished, tied it off, and finally leaned back, releasing a breath I did not realize I had been holding. "That is all I can do," I said, wiping my hands on my apron again, though this time the motion felt different, less about routine and more about grounding myself in something real. He shifted slightly, testing his balance against the worn cushions, and I instinctively reached out before catching myself, my hand hovering in the space between us before slowly pulling back. His eyes followed the movement, noting it, storing it somewhere behind that controlled expression. "You stayed," he said, not a question. I shrugged, though the motion felt too small for the weight of what had just happened. "You needed help," I repeated, because it was the only answer I had. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car passed, its headlights briefly cutting through the thin curtains and casting moving shadows across the walls, and for a second, the world outside reminded me that it still existed, that this room was not everything. But inside, time felt different, stretched thin between two people who should never have met. He leaned his head back slightly, eyes closing for a brief moment, not in weakness but in calculation, like he was allowing himself exactly 3 seconds of stillness before returning to whatever world he came from. When his eyes opened again, They were different, sharper, more present. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara," I said, my voice quieter now, because somehow that question felt more dangerous than anything else. "Clara," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it, committing it to memory in a way that made something in my chest tighten unexpectedly. "You understand," he continued, his tone shifting just enough to carry something beneath the words, "that tonight did not happen in a vacuum." I frowned. Slightly, not fully understanding, but aware enough to feel the edges of something bigger pressing in. "I understand that I helped someone who needed it," I said carefully, holding his gaze even as a flicker of doubt tried to break through my calm. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied me, and I had the unsettling sense that he was measuring more than my words, that he was weighing something I could not see. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "You made a choice," he said, his voice steady, certain, like a verdict being delivered rather than a conversation being had. I swallowed, the room suddenly feeling smaller again, the air a little thinner. "So did you," I replied before I could stop myself. Something flickered in his expression then, not quite surprise, not quite approval, but something that made the silence that followed feel charged, alive, and in that moment, standing. In a room that had never held anything more complicated than thread and fabric, I realized that whatever had walked through my door tonight was not just a man who needed saving, but a decision I would not be able to undo. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty but waiting, like the room itself was listening for something neither of us had said yet, and I became suddenly aware of every small detail around me. The faint ticking of the clock inching past 2:13 a.m., the hum of the old radiator struggling against the cold, the soft rustle of fabric where his sleeves shifted against the worn couch. I should have felt relief, I think, that he was stable now, that whatever had brought him to my door had not taken him away again. But instead there was something else settling in my chest, something quieter and heavier, like the realization that this moment was not an ending, but the beginning of something I did not understand. Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his posture controlled despite the strain it must have cost him, and for the first time, his gaze moved away from me, scanning the room with slow, deliberate precision. Nothing in here was worth looking at, not really. A second-hand table with uneven legs, stacks of unfinished garments, a sewing machine that had outlived better days, but he studied it all like it told him something important. "This is where you live," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet conclusion. I shook my head, crossing my arms without realizing it, as if that could somehow reclaim the space from his observation. "This is where I work," I corrected, though the line between the two had blurred a long time ago. He nodded once, absorbing that distinction, and something in his expression shifted again, not softer, not kinder, but more certain. "And the rest," he said, his voice low, "you do not get to choose." The words landed sharper than anything else he had said, not because of how they sounded, but because of how true they felt. I let out a breath, slow and controlled, refusing to let that truth show on my face. "Most people do not," I replied, meeting his gaze again, unwilling to let him see the parts of me that already knew that. For a second, something like approval flickered across his features, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Outside, the distant sound of an engine grew louder, then slowed, then stopped, and my entire body went still before I could stop it. I had lived here long enough to recognize patterns, and this was not one of the usual ones. Adrian noticed, of course he did, his head turning slightly toward the window, listening in a way that felt entirely different from mine, more focused, more aware. The air in the room shifted, tightening in a way I could not explain, and suddenly I was very aware of how close I stood to him, how small this space really was. Headlights swept briefly across the thin curtains, casting long shadows that stretched and disappeared just as quickly. And then there were footsteps, measured and purposeful, approaching from the alley outside. My breath caught, a reflex I could not control, and I looked at him, searching for something, reassurance, explanation, anything. He did not look back at me right away. Instead, he stood, slower than before but steady, every movement deliberate, as if the room had become a stage and he was stepping back into a role he knew too well. When his eyes finally met mine again, they were no longer questioning, no longer observing, but certain in a way that made my chest tighten. "They are not here for you," he said quietly, and somehow that did not make me feel better. The handle of the door turned once, firm and precise, followed by a knock that was not really a knock at all, just enough sound to announce presence without asking permission. I realized then, standing in the middle of my small, borrowed life, that whatever I had pulled inside tonight had not come alone, and that the choice I made at that door was about to step fully into the light. The knock did not come again, as if whoever stood on the other side already knew waiting was unnecessary. And that was what unsettled me the most, not the sound itself, but the quiet confidence behind it. I realized my hands had curled into fists at my sides, the fabric of my apron twisting between my fingers as I forced myself to stay still, to not react in a way that would give away how far out of my depth I really was. Adrian moved before I could think, not rushed, not careless, just precise, like every step had already been decided long before this moment arrived. He crossed the small space between us and the door with a calm that felt completely disconnected from the tension pressing against the walls, and when he reached for the handle, he did not hesitate. The door opened inward with a soft click, revealing two men standing just beyond the threshold, both dressed in dark coats that fit too well to be accidental, their posture straight, their expressions controlled in a way that immediately told me they were not here by chance. The taller one stepped forward first, his gaze flicking briefly to me before returning to Adrian, and in that single glance I felt seen in a way that made me wish I could disappear into the walls. "Sir," he said, his voice low and respectful, carrying a weight that did not need volume to be understood. Adrian did not respond right away. Instead, he stood there, just inside the doorway, his presence filling the frame in a way that made the room feel even smaller than before. "You are early," he said finally, his tone even, as if this was nothing more than a delayed meeting rather than something that had found him in the middle of the night in a place like this. The man inclined his head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that felt more like agreement than apology. "Circumstances changed," he replied. "I stayed where I was, a few feet behind, unsure if I should move, unsure if I was even supposed to be part of this moment at all, but unable to step away." The second man remained silent, his attention scanning the room with the same quiet calculation I had seen in Adrian earlier, noting every detail, every imperfection, every sign of a life lived in limitation. Adrian stepped aside just enough to let them in, a small gesture that somehow felt like a shift in control rather than a concession. And as they crossed the threshold, the air changed again, heavier now, more defined, like the invisible lines of something I could not see had just been drawn around me. "She helped me," Adrian said, his voice cutting cleanly through the silence, and for a second, all three of them looked at me, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with something far more unsettling, recognition. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to hold their gaze, to not shrink under the weight of it, even as every instinct told me to step back. The taller man nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Then she matters," he said simply. The words landed heavier than they should have, not because of how they were spoken, but because of what they implied. Adrian turned slightly, just enough that his shoulder angled toward me, not blocking me, not shielding me, but placing himself between me and something I still did not fully understand. "She made a choice," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. The room fell into silence again, but it was not the same silence as before. This one felt final, like something had just been decided without my permission, and standing there, in the space that had always been mine, I realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten that whatever came next was no longer just about the man I had saved, but about the world he had brought with him, and the way it had already started to close around me. No one asked me anything, and somehow that felt worse than being questioned, because silence left too much room for decisions I was not part of. I stood there, just a few steps away, watching as Adrian moved deeper into the room that had always been mine, yet no longer felt like it belonged to me at all. The two men followed his lead without hesitation, their presence controlled but absolute, as if the boundaries of my world had already shifted to accommodate them. We need to leave, the taller one said after a moment, his tone calm, but carrying a weight that suggested this was not a suggestion. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted back to me, steady and unreadable, and for a second, everything else in the room faded into the background again. She stays, he said quietly. The words were simple, but the effect was immediate, the tension in the room tightening just enough to be felt. The second man shifted his stance slightly, not challenging, but adjusting, as if recalculating something unseen. That may not be possible, he replied, his voice even, professional, but firm in a way that made my chest tighten. I should have stepped back then, should have said something, anything to separate myself from whatever this conversation was becoming, but I did not. I stayed exactly where I was, rooted in place by something I could not explain. Adrian took one step closer to me, not enough to touch, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional. Clara, he said, my name sounding different in his voice now, less like a question and more like a decision. Do you trust me? The question landed harder than anything else that night, not because of what it meant, but because of how impossible it was to answer. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening slightly against my palms as I searched his face for something I could hold on to. I barely know you, I said honestly, my voice quieter now, but steady. Something in his expression shifted again, not frustration, not impatience, but something closer to understanding. That is enough, he replied, before I could respond. He turned back to the two men, the shift in his posture immediate, the quiet intensity returning in full. She is not part of this, he said, each word precise. The taller man met his gaze without hesitation, a silent exchange passing between them that I could not interpret. She already is, he answered. The room fell silent again, heavier this time, as if that truth had settled into the walls themselves. I felt it then, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when something irreversible has already happened and you are just now catching up to it. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign that the words had landed. Then it ends here, he said. I did not understand what that meant, not fully, but the certainty in his voice made my pulse quicken. The second man glanced toward me again, not unkind, but assessing, as if measuring what I was worth in a situation I never chose. It does not end that easily, he said quietly. Adrian did not respond right away. Instead, he looked at me once more, and this time there was something different in his gaze, something that felt less like observation and more like intent. You wanted a quiet life, he said, his voice softer now, almost reflective. I nodded slightly, unsure where this was going. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then added, that is no longer an option. The words settled into the space between us, final and unmovable. And in that moment, standing in the only place I had ever managed to call my own, I realized that saving him had not just changed his fate, it had rewritten mine in ways I was only beginning to understand. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between us like something permanent, something that refused to be ignored, and I felt them sink deeper with every second that passed. A quiet life is no longer an option. I repeated it in my head without meaning to, as if saying it enough times might make it less real, but it only made the room feel smaller, tighter, like the air itself had shifted to accommodate a future I had not agreed to. I straightened slowly, my shoulders pulling back not out of confidence but out of necessity, because if I let myself shrink now, I was not sure I would ever stand up again. You do not get to decide that for me, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though my pulse had not slowed since the moment those men stepped through my door. The taller one glanced at Adrian, just briefly, as if waiting to see how he would respond, but Adrian did not look away from me, not even for a second. It is not about what I decide, he said, quietly. It is about what already changed. I swallowed, the truth in his words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit, but I refused to let that be the end of it. Then explain it, I said, taking a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make it clear I was not stepping back. Explain why helping someone means I lose my life in the process. The room stilled again, but this time it felt different. Not like something closing in, but like something waiting to unfold. Adrian studied me, not with the detached calculation from before, but with something sharper, more focused, as if this moment mattered in a way the others had not. Because people will ask how I survived, he said, his voice low, controlled, each word deliberate. And answers create paths, paths led back. Here, I felt my breath catch, not out of fear this time, but out of understanding, slow and unwelcome. So what? I said, though the question felt smaller than what I was really asking. I disappear. The second man shifted slightly, as if the word itself carried weight, but Adrian shook his head once, firm and immediate. No, he said. You do not disappear. There was something in the way he said it that made my chest tighten again, something that felt less like reassurance and more like certainty. Then what happens to me? I asked, softer now, because suddenly this felt less like an argument and more like a line I had already crossed. He took a step closer, closing the space I had created, and for a moment the rest of the room faded again. The men, the door, the world outside, all of it pushed to the edges of my awareness. You come with me, he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made everything else feel insignificant by comparison. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was nothing amusing about any of this. That is not an answer, I said, shaking my head slightly, trying to hold on to something that still belonged to me. That is a decision. Something flickered in his expression again, that same unreadable shift I had noticed before, but this time it lingered just a second longer. It is both, he replied. The taller man glanced toward the window, then back to Adrian, a silent reminder that time was not standing still for any of us. I felt it too, the urgency creeping in at the edges, the sense that whatever choice existed here would not exist for long. I looked at Adrian, really looked at him, at the man I had pulled from the shadows just hours ago, and realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten that he was not asking me to step into his world. He was telling me that I already had, and for the first time since this night began, I understood that walking away was no longer something I could do, not because he would stop me, but because the version of my life that existed before that door opened had already closed behind me. For a moment, no one moved, and that was what made it real, not the words, not the decision, but the stillness that followed, like the world had paused just long enough for me to understand that whatever came next would not wait for me to be ready. I looked around the room without meaning to, my eyes catching on the small details I had stopped noticing over the years, the uneven stack of fabric by the wall, the chipped mug on the table, the faint stain on the floor that never quite came out no matter how hard I tried. This place had never been much, but it had been mine, or at least as close to mine as anything had ever been. I have a life here, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, they felt thinner than they should have, like they did not carry enough weight to stand against everything else in the room. Adrian followed my gaze, taking in the same details, but where I saw familiarity, he saw something else entirely. You have survival, he said quietly, and that was worse somehow, because it was not unkind, it was not dismissive, it was simply true. I exhaled slowly, my shoulders tightening as I turned back to him. And what you are offering is what, exactly? I asked, not challenging, not yet, but needing something more than a statement. His expression did not change, but there was a shift in his posture, something more grounded, more certain, as if this was the part he understood best. A different kind of choice, he replied. I let out a small breath that almost turned into a laugh, though there was no humor in it. That does not sound like a choice, I said, shaking my head slightly. That sounds like an exchange. The taller man moved subtly near the door, not interrupting, but reminding both of us that time was not stretching the way it felt inside this room. Adrian took another step closer, closing the space between us until I could feel the quiet gravity of his presence again, steady and unyielding. You already gave something, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. I am deciding what it was worth. The words landed heavier than anything else he had said, not because they were loud, but because they carried a kind of certainty I had never experienced before. I searched his face for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that suggested this could still be negotiated, but there was none. You do not get to decide that either, I said, softer now, but no less firm, holding his gaze even as my pulse refused to slow. Something shifted again, not in him, But in the space between us, something that felt like the balance of control tilting in a way I could not fully understand. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied me, and I had the strange, unsettling feeling that this was the first real answer he had been waiting for. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Good," he said. I frowned slightly, caught off guard by the response. "Good?" I repeated. "You should not accept something you do not understand," he replied, his tone calm, almost measured, as if we were discussing something far less complicated than the direction of my life. I felt my breath steady slightly, though the tension in the room did not ease. "Then explain it better," I said, because if I was already standing at the edge of something irreversible, I was not going to step forward blindly. He held my gaze for a second longer, then glanced briefly toward the men near the door before looking back at me. "Tomorrow," he said. The word was simple, but it carried a promise I could not yet define. "Tomorrow, you will understand what freedom looks like when it is not borrowed." The room fell quiet again, but this time it felt different, less like something closing in and more like something waiting to unfold. And standing there, surrounded by the pieces of a life that suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before, I realized that whatever tomorrow brought, it would not just change where I lived, it would change what I believed I was allowed to become. The word tomorrow stayed with me long after it was said, lingering in the air even as everything else began to move again, as if that single promise had shifted the weight of the entire night forward into something I could not yet see. Adrian turned slightly, his attention returning to the men by the door, and whatever passed between them next was quiet, efficient, spoken in low tones that carried meaning without needing volume. I did not catch every word, but I did not need to, because the rhythm of it told me enough. This was not new for them, not unexpected, just another adjustment in a world that moved around him without hesitation. I stood where I was, watching, listening, trying to hold on to the edges of something familiar, but there was nothing left to anchor me. After a moment, the taller man nodded once, then stepped back toward the door, his presence easing just enough to signal that whatever urgency had brought them here was now under control. Adrian glanced at me. Again, just briefly, as if confirming that I was still there, still exactly where he had left me. "You should rest," he said, his voice quieter now, less commanding but no less certain. I almost laughed at that, the idea of rest feeling distant and out of place in a night that had rewritten itself every few minutes. "I do not think I can," I admitted, my voice softer than before, the edge of defiance fading into something more honest. Something in his expression shifted again, not softened, not exactly, but aware. "Then sit," he replied, a simple instruction that felt strangely grounding. I hesitated for a second, then moved, lowering myself onto the chair near the sewing machine, the familiar creak of the wood beneath me offering a small, steady reminder that something in this room still belonged to me. The two men stepped outside without another word. The door left slightly open, and for the first time since they arrived, the space felt almost like it had before. Almost. Adrian remained standing, his posture still controlled, but there was a subtle change in the way he held himself now, as if the tension had shifted from immediate to something more distant, more calculated. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, testing the word again as if it might reveal something new this time. He heard it anyway. Of course he did. "Yes," he replied, his tone steady. I looked up at him, studying his face in a way I had not allowed myself to before, taking in the details I had ignored in the rush of everything else, the sharp lines, the stillness behind his eyes, the kind of control that did not come from practice alone, but from something deeper, something lived. "And if I say no?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop. Because for all the certainty that had filled the room, I needed to know if there was still a choice hidden somewhere inside it. He did not answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out into the alley, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the streetlight. For a long moment, he said nothing, and I felt my pulse pick up again, not out of fear this time, but anticipation. When he finally turned back to me, his expression was the same as before, controlled, unreadable, but his eyes held something new, something that felt almost like truth without comfort. Then tomorrow will still come, he said. The simplicity of it hit harder than any threat could have, because it was not about forcing me, not about taking anything from me. It was about something inevitable, something already set in motion. I sat there, my hands resting lightly on my knees, the quiet hum of the room returning around us, and for the first time that night, I understood that whatever choice I believed I had left was not between staying and leaving, but between understanding what was coming and pretending I could outrun it. And somehow, that felt like the most honest answer I had been given since the moment I opened that door. I do not remember deciding to sleep. Only the moment when exhaustion finally pulled me under like a quiet tide. I could not fight anymore, my body giving in before my mind could catch up, and when I opened my eyes again, the light had changed. It was softer, pale morning filtering through the thin curtains, turning the edges of the room into something almost unfamiliar. For a few seconds, I lay there still, disoriented, caught between the version of my life that existed yesterday and the one that had started to unfold in the dark. Then I saw him. Adrian was exactly where I had last seen him, though something about him looked different in the daylight, less shadowed, more defined, like the night had been a layer he had simply stepped out of. He stood near the window, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his posture relaxed in a way that felt intentional rather than casual, as if even rest was something he chose carefully. He did not turn when I moved, but I knew he was aware of it. "You should eat," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness of the morning. I pushed myself up slowly, the stiffness in my shoulders reminding me that this was not a dream, that everything from last night had followed me into today. "I usually start with coffee," I replied, my voice rough from sleep and something else I could not quite name. There was a brief pause, then the faintest shift in his stance. "There is coffee," he said. I frowned slightly, glancing toward the small table where I kept a chipped mug and a dented kettle, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed it. The cup was new, the steam rising from it steady and fresh. I stared at it for a second longer than I should have, the details settling into me slowly, the realization that someone had moved through this space while I was not aware. "You had time to arrange that," I said. Not quite a question. Adrian turned then, his gaze meeting mine, steady. "As always, time is rarely the problem," he replied. I exhaled quietly, pushing myself to my feet and crossing the small room, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. The floor creaked beneath me, the familiar sound grounding me just enough to keep everything from slipping too far out of reach. I picked up the cup, the warmth of it spreading through my hands, and for a moment, I focused on that instead of everything else. "You said tomorrow," I reminded him, lifting my eyes back to his. "This is tomorrow." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not hesitation, but something closer to acknowledgement. "Yes," he said. There was no build-up, no dramatic pause, just the simple confirmation that whatever came next was already in motion. I took a slow breath, the taste of the coffee steady and real, and forced myself to stand a little straighter. "Then show me," I said. The words came out quieter than I expected, but they did not waver. For a second, he studied me again. That same careful attention I had felt since the moment we met. But this time it felt different, less like evaluation and more like recognition. Then he nodded once, decisive. "Get dressed," he said. I almost smiled at that. A small, unexpected reaction that slipped through before I could stop it. "This is dressed," I replied, glancing down at the same clothes I had been wearing for far too many hours. Something in his gaze flickered, not judgment, not disapproval, but something that made me suddenly aware of how small my world had been before this moment. "Not for where we are going," he said. The words settled into the space between us, carrying something I could not yet define, something that felt both like a promise and a warning. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the details that had once felt permanent, and realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten that whatever he was about to show me was not just a different place. It was a different version of reality entirely, one that did not bend to the limits I had spent my whole life learning to accept. I did not ask where we were going again, not because I did not want to know, but because I understood now that the answer would not come in words, it would come in what he chose to show me. and somehow that felt more honest than anything he could have said. I moved toward the small closet in the corner, pulling it open to reveal the limited choices I had spent years pretending were enough. Worn fabrics, neutral colors, pieces chosen for durability rather than style, survival rather than expression. For a moment, I just stood there, my fingers brushing lightly over the hangers, and I felt something shift inside me, something quiet but undeniable, like I was seeing my own life from the outside for the first time. "You do not have to rush," Adrian said from behind me, his voice steady, giving space without stepping away. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried no humor. "I have never had the luxury of not rushing," I replied, selecting the cleanest option I had, a simple dress that fit well enough to pass for something intentional. I changed quickly, aware of his presence but not uncomfortable in the way I might have expected, because there was something in the way he held himself that made the space feel controlled, not invasive. When I turned back to him, smoothing the fabric down instinctively, he studied me for a moment, his gaze moving with quiet precision, not assessing my worth, but noting the details, the way I carried myself, the way I chose what little I had. "That will work," he said finally. I nodded once, more to myself than to him, and reached for my bag, the same worn leather strap sliding over my shoulder like a habit I could not break. He noticed. Of course he did. "You will not need that," he said. My hand paused on the strap, fingers tightening slightly. "I always need it," I replied, the words automatic, grounded in years of never having anything guaranteed. Something in his expression shifted again, not dismissing, not correcting, but understanding in a way that made me hesitate. "Not today," he said quietly. The certainty in his voice was not forceful, but it was immovable, and for a second, I stood there, caught between instinct and something new I did not yet recognize. Then, slowly, I let the bag slip from my shoulder, setting it back on the chair. The motion felt small, but it carried more weight than I expected, like I had just set down more than fabric and thread. Adrian watched me, not with approval, but with recognition, as if that single decision had told him more about me than anything else I had said. "Good," he murmured. The word was soft, almost lost in the quiet of the room, but I heard it. We moved toward the door together, not side by side exactly, but not separate either. The distance between us intentional, measured. When he opened it, the morning air felt different than it had the night before, sharper, clearer, as if the world outside had shifted just enough to match everything that had changed inside. The two men were waiting, their presence as steady as before, but now it felt less like an intrusion and more like part of something structured, something already in motion. One of them stepped forward, opening the back door of a black car parked just outside the alley, its surface reflecting the morning light in a way that made it look almost unreal against the worn brick and cracked pavement. I stopped for half a second, taking it in, the contrast so sharp it felt like stepping between two different versions of reality. Adrian did not rush me. He simply waited. I looked back once, just briefly, at the door I had walked through 1,000 times without thinking, and realized that this time, it felt different, like I was not just leaving for the day, but stepping away from something that had already begun to fade. Then I turned forward again, squared my shoulders, and stepped toward the car, understanding with a clarity that settled deep in my chest that whatever waited on the other side of that door was not just a different place, but a different definition of what my life could be. The door closed behind me with a soft, final sound that felt louder than anything else that morning, and for a brief second, I stood there beside the car, the cool air brushing against my skin as if trying to remind me where I had come from. But the moment passed too quickly to hold on to. The man by the door gestured slightly, not rushing me, just guiding, and I stepped forward, lowering myself into the back seat with careful movements, aware of everything, the smooth leather beneath my hands, the quiet click of the door closing, the way the outside world instantly dulled into something distant and muted. Adrian entered from the other side, his presence filling the space without crowding it, and as the car began to move, I realized how long it had been since I had been anywhere that did not require me to watch every detail, every turn, every second. The city passed by outside the window in familiar shapes. Storefronts I recognized, sidewalks I had walked 100 times, but from Here, everything looked different, quieter, more removed, like I was observing a life I had already stepped out of. I kept my gaze forward at first, my hands resting lightly in my lap, unsure what I was supposed to do with the stillness that surrounded me. "Where are we going?" I asked after a while, my voice steady but softer than before, not because I was afraid, but because the question felt less urgent now, more inevitable. Adrian glanced at me briefly, then back ahead, his expression unchanged, composed. "Somewhere that answers your question," he said. I let that settle, resisting the instinct to push further, because I had learned enough already to understand that he did not speak without purpose. The car turned onto a wider street, the buildings shifting from worn brick to polished glass, the lines cleaner, the air somehow different, and I felt something tighten in my chest as the contrast became impossible to ignore. This was not a place I had ever belonged to, not even in imagination. The car slowed, then came to a stop in front of a building that did not just stand out. It commanded attention, its structure tall and precise, its entrance framed in a way that suggested permanence, control, something built to last. The driver stepped out, moving around, to open the door, and for a second, I did not move. I just looked at it, the reflection of the morning light against the surface, the quiet movement of people who passed by without hesitation, as if this world operated on rules I had never been taught. "This is not necessary," I said quietly, though I was not entirely sure what I was referring to. The building, the car, the entire shift that had happened overnight. Adrian turned slightly toward me, his gaze steady, not dismissing, not forcing. "It is," he said. There was no argument in his tone, no need for one, just certainty. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything that had brought me here pressing in all at once, and then I stepped out of the car. The ground felt the same beneath my feet, solid, real, but everything else felt different, sharper, more defined, like I had crossed into something I could not step back from. Adrian moved beside me, not guiding, not touching, but present in a way that made the space feel structured, intentional. We walked toward the entrance together, the glass doors opening before we reached them. And as I stepped inside, the world shifted again, quieter, cleaner, controlled in a way that made my chest tighten with something I could not quite name. People moved with purpose here, voices low, footsteps measured, everything aligned in a way that made my old life feel distant and uneven by comparison. I looked at him then, searching for something, confirmation, explanation, anything that could anchor this moment. He met my gaze without hesitation, and for the first time since this began, there was something unmistakable in his expression, not just certainty, but intent. "You wanted to understand," he said quietly. I nodded, my breath steadying despite the weight in my chest. "Then look carefully," he added. I turned my attention forward again, taking in the space around me with new eyes, and as the realization settled in, slow and undeniable, I understood that this was not just about showing me something different. It was about revealing a world where the limits I had lived by no longer applied, and whether I was ready or not, I had already stepped inside it. I did not realize I had stopped walking until he stopped beside me. The movement so subtle I only noticed it because the world around us continued without pause. People passing, voices low, the rhythm of a place that did not wait for anyone to catch up. I stood there, just inside the entrance, my eyes moving slowly across the space, taking in details I would have ignored before. The polished floors that reflected light instead of absorbing it, the quiet confidence in the way people carried themselves, the absence of hesitation in every step, every decision. This was not just a building. It was a system, something designed to function without friction, without doubt, and I did not belong in it. The thought came clearly, but it did not push me back the way it once would have. Instead, it stayed, balanced against something else, something new that had started the moment I opened that door last night. Adrian did not speak right away, and I realized he was watching me again, not guiding, not explaining, just waiting. Waiting for me to see it on my own. I turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, I did not feel smaller under it. I felt aware. "This is your world," I said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization. He shook his head once, the motion calm, certain. "No," he replied. I frowned slightly, the answer not matching what I saw in front of me. Then what is it? I asked. He held my gaze for a second longer, then said, "It is a world where choices are not limited by what you can afford to lose." The words settled into me slowly, unfolding in a way that felt both simple and impossible at the same time. I looked around again, but this time differently, not as an outsider trying to understand, but as someone being asked to reconsider everything they thought they knew. "And you think I belong here?" I said, the question quieter now, not defensive, not doubtful, just honest. Adrian stepped slightly closer, not enough to close the space completely, but enough to shift the distance between us into something intentional. "I think," he said, his voice steady, "you have never been given the chance to decide where you belong." Something in my chest tightened at that. Not pain, not fear, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone names something you have never said out loud. I let out a slow breath, my hands resting loosely at my sides, no longer clenched, no longer holding on to something that was already gone. "And this," I gestured lightly around us. "This is that chance." He nodded once. "Part of it." I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the man who had walked into my life without warning and rewritten it without asking, and for the first time, I understood something that had been there all along. This was never about taking something from me. It was about showing me what had been taken long before he ever arrived. I turned back toward the space in front of me, the movement of people, the quiet order, the sense of control that ran beneath everything, and I realized that the fear I expected to feel was not there anymore. In its place was something else, something steadier, something that felt dangerously close to possibility. "What happens now?" I asked, not because I needed an answer, but because I was ready to hear it. Adrian did not hesitate this time. "Now," he said, his voice calm, certain, "you choose." The word landed differently than it ever had before, not as an idea, not as something distant or theoretical, but as something real, something placed directly in front of me. I stood there for a moment longer, letting it settle, letting everything from the past 24 hours align into something I could finally understand. Then I nodded, not to him, not to the space, but to myself, because for the first time in my life, I realized that saving him had not just changed where I was standing, it had changed who I was allowed to become, and whatever came next, it would not be something decided for me. It would be something I stepped into on my own terms.